So hi, I'm Rakhi Bakshi here, and welcome to what we think is a very special edition this afternoon on Her World India. As you know that we have a talk show series going on, and every week, but also on other days, we mount these talk shows to talk to people, experts, get their insights and knowledge. We partner with Miranda House College and their Policy Center and General Lab, and also we involve a lot of these people who would like to think and share these insights which come through the expert voices and then gain benefit out of that. We also have a portal where we keep writing on these issues, but I think this talking and these conversations which are very free flowing on Her World India, we get to not only learn, but also try and get note of what needs to be done. So also very special theme today that we're discussing, something which we really think is very pertinent, is domestic violence and harassment of women during COVID-19. And what a delight to also have two very esteemed speakers with us, and let's introduce them to you one by one. So we have Professor Rohini Sen, and let's have her slide here. You know, as we know that Professor Rohini Sen brings with her expertise of a vast nature. And can we hear a slide also on the screen that we can show? A doctoral candidate at University of Warwick, but also somebody who's Dean, Assistant Professor with the Jindal Law School, and let me get it all correct, Director also, Center for Human Rights Studies with the Jindal Global Law School, OP Jindal Global University. So somebody who comes with a great expertise when it comes to rights of women, justice and equality, and of course has always shared her views pertinently or through these virtual conferences that I just saw also and otherwise. And right now she continues to focus on these matters of equity all around. I welcome you, Professor Rohini Sen, to Her World India talk show today.
Thank you so much.
And now we have Professor Shireen Murthy. She's Assistant Professor of Law and Director of the Office of Alumni Relations, also with OP Jindal Global University. In fact, I must say that I'm really thankful that the university, which is also of global repute and has is dishing out such extreme knowledgeable experts. We have two with us, and these are ladies of eminence. I'm going to talk to them about issues that not only concern us, but also disturb us deeply at a time that we are dealing with COVID-19 pandemic. And it's been, as we are saying, the second wave is already there. We're talking about third wave. It's 1.5 years. But where do we stand? I start with Professor Rohini Sen and ask you, you know, silence, as we were just discussing, could be cozy for many. But, you know, the kind of harassment, the kind of suffering that women, especially during lockdown situations, have faced, where they had to perform, deliver, multitask, you know, also cater to expectations of all kind, whether at work or home, is really not only disturbing, but we also feel has been ignored largely, Professor Sen. How would you look at it?
You know, I think the biggest challenge here is, and I say this very often, when we think of a problem, we tend to think of a very limited aspect of the problem. And sometimes what we don't do is we don't problematize carefully. And this is an exercise I generally speak of across the spectrum. So when we are looking at the idea of domestic violence, harassment, and its amplification in the context of COVID, I think the exercise that we need to do collectively is problematize and understand what the overarching context is. The reason I say this is because very often what we think we are responding to is a symptom and not necessarily the problem. So this has been the case with domestic violence and any other issue that pertains to the domestic sphere. The narrative potential of how we frame this is very, very important. So in domestic violence related instances, policy, law, we have to look at what is being protected here. The women in the context of a particular understanding of domesticity. That understanding of domesticity doesn't change. It may change a little bit time. For instance, marriage may eventually be understood as a living arrangement, other domestic forms, and so on and so forth. But at the core of all of these constructs, we want to preserve these relations as they are. And therein lies the problem, because in most of these relational aspects, the role that women perform is very gendered to start with. So what we end up doing is, within this context, we say what you can do can change, can amplify, can widen, but the overarching nature of the relationship should not move too much. And in the context of the pandemic, what has happened is the domestic sphere has been confined.
Hmm.
So people's response to the pandemic, to the confinement, to the disruption of their daily routine activity has come out in this sphere through behaviors that they have never considered inappropriate to start with. Because relationally, abusing the woman, being a little violent, putting her in her place, taking her economic empowerment away has never been seen as a problem. So therein lies the thing. My understanding is in domestic violence and any other sphere, what we really protect is the foundational conventional relationship.
So, yeah. Okay, so very, very pertinently put here, Professor Sen. Shireen, I come to you and ask you, since you also talk about labor laws, apart from constitutional law that you're an expert on. So we are also looking at the labor market vis-a-vis women. And we saw that pandemic, in fact, not only lessened opportunities for women to go outside and work, within home, her work changed its nature in many ways. We are looking at homemakers, their lives. We're looking at women who are working from home. How would you look at this whole labor and women scenario happening through this pandemic? Shireen.
Thank you, Rakhi ma'am, for that question. So basically, women's participation in the labor market itself is a little bit difficult because of the challenge in balancing act at home and act at office in normal times. Balancing home and office has always been a challenge. And from top CEOs to people who are working in those so-called pink professions, all of them talk about balancing this act because a lot of housework is gendered in nature, be it cooking, cleaning, taking care of the children, taking care of elderly parents. So the first go-to person becomes the lady of the house. And she herself also goes through a lot of guilt in case she's unable to deliver on those aspects at home. And then work becomes secondary. So this is a normal understanding of a woman's role in society, in family. And career is something that is an add-on. Even today, we have not shifted or moved away from this understanding of women in society. And that has only aggravated during COVID-19 and especially during the lockdown, because the burden has not only doubled, but even become far greater than in normal times. And what I feel is that it requires a lot of conscious thinking on the parts of families, that how much work can our mothers do, how much work can a lady do in the house, and also deliver at the professional front. So I think it's a lot to do with the family arrangement and the setup that is organized at home. I think definitely because of the fact that you see women in this role of not only taking care of the house, but also bringing in some income, it has added to a lot of physical, emotional stress and mental stress of women, taking a toll on their health. In fact, all of this contributes to a public health burden, which also has consequences for the GDP. So today, if we want to even maintain the participation of women in the labor market, we need to divide responsibilities at home. We need to, other members need to take more responsibility, and that should become the norm rather than a deviant sort of situation.
Okay, and let's break it into different issues also. I want to go to Professor Sen again and ask her. You look at, we on our show had sessions of different kinds. We had lots of women from all sectors. So some of these women who were working in ICU as senior doctors also, in fact, shared their own plight. The kind of harassment they have gone through, like somebody said, somebody was asking, oh, beautiful eyes. Even in that scenario of crisis, to catering in all kinds of pressures to the patients, their relatives. How would you look at this whole toll being taken only mainly by women? And how would you really put your thoughts on COVID health workers all around, not only globally, but in India especially?
So, there are two very important things here. The first is the perception and visibility. In terms of expectation, as Shireen was also saying, it's not that the domestic burden or the emotional labor that women generally do in these situations has been done away with. It's just that with employment and other responsibilities, their work has increased. the expectation of who responds a particular way in these situations, who doesn't react, who doesn't rock the boat, is still on women fundamentally. So when I say the perception, the normalizing of these kind of behavior, including violence, as we were, as I was saying in the opening segment, that within a domestic sphere, violence on women is not seen as something very outrageous. So similarly, within workplaces, seeing women a certain way, objectifying them, understanding them as these compartmentalized beings who can be sexualized, are also working. These sort of thought processes are not challenged at all. And what I find most interesting is most of these workplaces and institutions are not designed for women. The public sphere has always been designed for the man. You've taken the woman and you've thrown her in the public sphere, and you expect her to adapt to what is predominantly male behavior, instead of slowly molding the public sphere to fully understand what inclusion of women means. We constantly expect women to adapt to this. This is at the root of the problem. Now, this is not something you just address in terms of these institutions. There are two very important institutions that we completely neglect. One is primary school and the other is family. It starts here. This is where the conversation starts. We somehow magically imagine that once they're in the professional workforce, everything will fall into place. And
Doesn't
these
happen.
two institutions are completely untouched. So the way I see it, these have to be understood for what they are: institutions where people pick up these behaviors, where people learn these perceptions, and then they carry them forward. And that's the kind of conversation we should be having about family spaces, primary schools, and then the workplace that can imagine a woman as a very integral structural part, not something you throw into the mix.
No, so I want to come back to again also on this, and we saw that this in inter intimate partner violence also rose. So I mean, we were of course also talking to doctors who talked about the kind of problems women shared who were at home. So the kind of this whole very so-called secret relationship matters between men and women, the kind of privacy which was just nowhere for women inside the home in the lockdown situations, the kind of, as I said, sudden expectation, multifold expectation as to how women were preparing more and better food, nurturing women, their school education, online ones, catering to so many things which were increased during the lockdown. So how would you look at that space that you're talking about, process sane within the family? What we've seen, and we were talking about, for example, NCW in India said, oh, cases have increased of domestic violence. But what we have not heard, please talk about that.
This is very important, because as the disruption of routine behavior was seen as one of the correlative things that led to this enhanced violence. This is interesting because first, what about this disruption will motivate you to go on to violence? The second thing is, what is it about the person that makes you think this is a viable person to inflict violence and harassment on? And the third is, are there intervening factors that can stop these violence? All of these went for a general disarray, in the sense that when we speak of the family space, we have seen the emotional labor aspect of it is done by women. There are behavioral expectations from men. Don't think about your emotions, don't process them. That's something women do. So when you're contained, and things like unemployment and other things you may not have comprehended pre-pandemic, and there are other emotional stress of just being locked up in something like this, the processing of that is not something that men do or have been asked to do, as when they're younger, when they go into institutional spaces. So as feminists, one of the important things that we do is relationship making and maintaining, and somehow it's presumed that this is a task that's left to women only. The process of relationship making is rarely something that men engage with. It's constantly displaced. So this is one of the motivations. Because they're unable to process, it's fundamentally then displaced on the woman. Now women, for a host of reasons, see it more viable to continue the relationship, to hold the domestic fort in a certain manner rather than extracting themselves. And in terms of who could potentially intervene, organizations that could stop domestic violence were limited because of the spaces that they had. Other kinds of interventions were limited because social distancing was paramount in these situations. So things that could presumably recreate social spaces was fundamentally barred during the pandemic. I mean, aside from the unique challenges of this pandemic, I think we generally need to understand, in the absence of pandemic also, how can we recalibrate these things in general.
Okay. These are some very, very good points. We are going to also talk about the kind of steps taken maybe globally, but also in India. But I go to now Professor Shireen and ask her, so many things. Suddenly, talk about the caregiving part. Right now, we all know that as far as homemakers are concerned, the judiciary also started looking at that and saying, oh, how can we really compensate for the kind of work they do? Now here we are talking about the kind of work again women were doing, multi-fold. How would you look at nobody really understanding in terms of value what it means, Shireen?
So that's an interesting conversation that has started from the Supreme Court itself, that how do you really value housework and should it be counted in the GDP and whether that is a possibility. Whereas the scholarly work in this area is quite divided, whether that amounts to a certain disbalance in society if you start quantifying the work at home, and whether that would help in preserving the family structure that is so traditional and innate to our society itself, and whether it would lead to more violence against women as compared to what it already is. Because status quo is something that serves the society, and if you try to move against it, it is going to lead to an increased anger and frustration amongst other family members, leading to increased violence against women. So when we talk about this, we have to see the social, political, and economic context of a country and how different are social and legal spaces. Legal mindset, laws can change. For example, we have had the Prevention of Violence Against Women, prevention of
In 2013, yeah.
PWDVA, which is for the Domestic Violence Act, popularly known as, since 2005. And even before that, we had measures under the IPC and CRPC and so on and so forth to deal with domestic violence. But even today, we have failed to implement it in its true spirit. So it calls for reflection that how far can legal changes or reform transform the society? It has to go hand in hand. It's not a one-dimensional problem, it's a multi-dimensional problem, and therefore it requires a multi-pronged approach, wherein not only the government agencies, individuals themselves, and civil society organizations, all three have to work hand in hand to solve this larger issue of violence against women and not to perpetuate it further by radical changes or radical measures. Though it's a good idea and maybe it makes economic sense from one scholarly point of view, but how would you actually arrive at it and what purpose would it serve are larger questions that need to be thought about even before entertaining the idea of going down that road.
And that's where I come to Professor Sen again and talk about the kind of, you talked about civil society participation and how citizens should be more alert to look at these nuances, these very troubled points, so to say, when we look at the gendered perspective of any crisis, and in this case, the pandemic. But Professor Sen, look at the authorities, look at the government. Right now, you just begun to talk about shadow pandemic. But what more measures, because you're looking at also at the global perspective. So vis-a-vis that, in India, especially also, how do you see these steps were even looked at, keep apart being worked on?
So, as you say, these steps were not even considered, which tells you what we think is important in terms of addressing. I mean, in India, we saw a phase where even the pandemic itself was not considered relevant enough to be addressed with a sense of immediacy. So you can very well imagine that other things that go on in non-pandemic times also are not given that sense of urgency, that sense of priority, fundamentally because, as Shireen said, it disrupts the status quo in a way that's not really palatable for people. There are two things in terms of this, and I keep coming back to the narrative potential of it, that I think is very important. These are seen as fragmented issues instead of interconnected issues. These are fundamentally interconnected, but the way we frame it, we fragment it to the extent that it becomes a specialized problem to address, specialized problem within this context of women. So we completely reduce the actual number of stakeholders in this. So family members should be participating, policymakers should be participating, there should be general civil society discussion around this. Instead of that, we make it a specific women's problem, take recourse to law, be in conversation with lawyers. That's not how this is. So until and unless we are able to talk about the interconnected nature, the apparent fact that with the pandemic, you could right away see a correlation in the domestic violence enhancement aspect, harassment, clearly tells you they're related. So centering the relationship of these things and how they're interconnected is very important from the perspective of policy. And the second thing that I say is we obviously always forget that law is something in context. Who is making the law is an individual who's embedded in this context. Who is using the law are also people who are embedded in the context. So, in case of domestic violence, for instance, you see that some of the people who can enforce this, the police, for instance, because they were busy doing other things in the pandemic, border control, maintaining the lockdown regulations and all, the amount of apathy they developed towards domestic violence was just, staggering. Even on a daily basis, when domestic violence cases would come to police, the general tendency is to turn them away, because at the heart of domestic violence, as we were saying, lies the desire to save the relationship. So reconciliation is encouraged, not any other way of imagining the problem. And because they were busy in the pandemic, and one also has to account for the fact that the police in India are not exactly, this is not a very high paying job. It's not a profession that comes with a set of comforts. So their approach towards the domestic violence aspect was that this is the least of our concerns right now. So this, interconnected centering and always remembering that any policy, any law works in context. And what is the context? How have these people always perceived domestic violence in the scale of importance? How do they perceive gendered behavior as something they should address? And then we are making laws within these parameters. The two
But
things
would you also like to see it vis-a-vis how globally things were in terms of, we were seeing even high development index countries, I was just trying to read, also faced problems which are not there, and it was increased. So how would you really look at a comparative kind of, analysis of what was happening elsewhere and also in India?
No, you're absolutely right. The crux of why this nature of violence, this nature of harassment increased, and in other places you saw racial dimensions as well. It wasn't just limited to gender, there was this incorporation of racially perceiving that some people were capable of certain kind of labor, therefore subjected to more exploitation. It kind of goes back to the construct. Where have we imagined the roles? It's precisely what we were talking about a while ago. Normatively, all these structures cater to a male perspective. Now, how do we think about this perspective through the eyes of this particular crisis or any other crisis, is where are the kind of conversations that we should be having in areas where infrastructure allows for. We also have a huge informal economy, which a lot of other places don't. So in areas that allow for that kind of accountability, where the state is able to give you some employment benefits, it becomes a slightly different conversation, because you fall within the ambit of the resources of the state. In a country like ours, where you have a massive informal economy, a lot of your workforce is outside workforce regulation, it's a very different conversation to have. So one, gendered; two, labor, the class dimensions of it, and then there are other interconnected aspects. So a term that we use very often is, one has to think of these from the perspective of intersectionality. It's not, you inhabit multiple identities, and you need to just sort of recognize them and then start zooming on each of them depending on the issues that we are talking about.
How interestingly that you've put it forth. And I think all these points, I must say, that as we are talking about in this session, should be pointed, noted as points of serious discussion, taking it forward. And I hope some of these people who are in authorities are taking, even now at this stage, which we feel a little late, and work on it. But I now come to you, Shireen, and also ask you, talking about this class intersectionality, we also saw, and please remember, last year especially, these domestic help, the workers who were suddenly again abandoned, either not really looked at in terms of what their misery was. We looked at, people who were migrating, some of these women who had no choice or option but to tag along with their male partners. So that class, how would you really look at the suffering, which is not even discussed, maybe on a wider scale?
Yes, definitely. That is a very important question that we need to address. That who were most affected by the lockdown, and they were migrant laborers, and especially within them, the women class and the children. They were the most affected when it came to the nationwide lockdown that was imposed last year, and then the lockdown that happened even this year. The idea is, and a very important point that we should note down, is that the lockdown was imposed without any advisory or circular or protocol or directives with respect to how can a woman who is in distress, be it domestic violence or otherwise, approach the state support services like helplines, protection officers, legal aid services, police, shelter homes, and courts. And a lot of this has to do with the kind of priority we give issues that are related to violence against women during normal times, and also and more so during a COVID-19 ongoing pandemic. The idea is that even if you look at courts, for example, they were hearing only urgent matters, and the matters with respect to domestic violence took a backseat. In fact, the civil society organizations that offer exemplary services in terms of short-term benefits and long-term support services in the form of counseling, psychiatric help, shelter, they were not regarded as essential services. Therefore, there was a huge disconnect between, at one end, an increase in the incidence of domestic violence because of the victim being isolated with the perpetrator, and on the other hand, a lack of access to support services, be it family or institutional. The government did come to recognize this, and the court also passed a few orders. For example, the Kerala High Court said that, what is being done with respect to the helplines, and what are the kind of support services you're offering the victims of domestic violence. Even after that, we had a helpline number 181. It wasn't nationwide. It worked in some states. It did not work in the other states, and the response was dismal.
And at times, in fact, at times you didn't know whether these helplines were working or not. You just put a number and you said, please contact us, this and this, but maybe it was not functioning many a times.
Definitely, and that has been reported as well, ma'am. So the idea is that even if you had these support services, they weren't of qualitative support, and therefore did not render the necessary help that was required by the victims of domestic violence. And if you talk about migrant laborers, they weren't even aware of these helplines, or didn't even have that kind of access to technology in order to sort of reach out to NGOs. Some NGOs did disruptive work by using technology, using mobile phones in order to give counseling services, give support services to the victims. In fact, what is also interesting is that you have shelter homes that are state supported and sponsored, and they weren't taking new victims of domestic violence. And later on, when they started admitting new people, they asked for a COVID-19 negative report. And there was a fall in the number of people who had approached the NGOs as well, simply because they did not have access to a mobile phone or some technology in order to report the matter to the NGO. So in fact, overall, the National Commission of Women is reporting that there was the number of complaints that they received doubled during the pandemic. But on the contrary, the civil society organizations did not get that kind of complaints from the victims of domestic violence, because simply they did not have a viable means of accessing these services. So this is very difficult, and I think it's a pandemic within a pandemic and not a shadow pandemic anymore.
Very, very great points actually that you've put across again, Shireen. But I come to you again, Professor Sen, talking about two things here. As she said, the quality of support. So in terms of funding, in terms of infrastructural support, which was specially designed to look at women's problems, was absent. I'm sure you'll agree, and you can talk about that. And also, when you talk about this whole, though there is universality of violence against women, but look at the urban and the rural kind of scenario. And in rural areas, especially, women had, again, different kinds of problems, whether it's about awareness, as Shireen was saying, whether going on social media, understanding it because much was available there, using your smartphone, which is not even available in many cases. How would you look at these points, Professor Sen?
These are very, very pertinent points that she made, especially something Shireen said towards the end that, in terms of the number of calls that civil society organizations who do this kind of work were getting on account of absence to access through devices, through any other thing. And of course, physical access, this was a huge challenge. And this is something we have seen substantively. Take the vaccination measure, for example. I'm deviating slightly, but most of the vaccination booking was happening through smartphones. It requires you to be in possession of the device, to have an internet access and literacy. So a few weeks earlier, we had done an event with workers on the ground, especially medical professionals and others, about what is happening with the pandemic in rural India. And their response was, all your measures, rural India, and their response was, all your measures are keeping in mind urban population, including
Exactly.
access to basic care. So
Exactly.
knowing the rural challenges, we keep going back to problematizing. We don't know what the rural challenges are. We're implementing urban framework. Within that, there are all these concerns of, how labor is distributed in a gendered manner in domestic space. If you're already in the informal economy, and one of the correlations we very frequently see with something like domestic violence is alcoholism. So the
Mhm.
unemployment aspect of it that feeds into that. And then in order to create subsistence family income, invariably you find the women of the family taking up a series of low paying jobs. So this is not a rural aspect of how violence works. We cater to this keeping in mind that, oh, if there's a crisis you can use this helpline to access, but we're not providing the infrastructure for it, not internet, not any other viable means through which you can access. So suddenly in course of the pandemic, when social distancing became prevalent and absolutely imminent, people
Hmm.
realize that recourses you use are so, the imagination is so rural that we've not even thought about these things.
No,
So
so for example, ASHA workers, we in fact had, a show, and I'm really proud to say that they came and they were, in fact, very emotional because they had not shared, and been on screen. And, but of course, they talked about their own, challenges. And right now, we're not even, Maharashtra recently, I was reading, has looked at incentivizing them in a little better manner. But we're not even looking at this army of ASHA workers on the ground, reaching out to people and doing the job that they are doing fabulously otherwise.
they are the backbone of this conversation. ASHA workers have done substantive amount of work, much more than anybody else. And I often wonder, this is something we should seriously be asking ourselves, I often wonder, in terms of compensation, it's COVID-19 that made us think that this is essential work. Why were we not thinking of this as essential work prior to that? it
Exactly.
this is not something. And the way people are compensated for the work that they do in a private sector, if you're working in the technology sector, you're compensated, or even law firms for that matter. It behooves me to think that those are the places where you're earning some substantial amount of money, whereas the backbone of what is considered societal structure and the work are done in these places. So how we imagine these sort of compensatory structures is also very interesting to me. That at a
Yeah.
very fundamental level, what we prioritize is that sort of nature of work.
Okay. So I can see that Professor Kalyan is also joining. Would you also like to say something if she was there on our earlier show? Would you like to say something? If you can hear us, please unmute her if she
Deepak,
can.
Deepak, I request you to please give Kalyani
Unmute
Uncle
Kalyani
ma'am.
ma'am. Also, then by the time she joins in, there is another question coming in here, and I would like to take that because we also talked about sexual harassment. For example, I can tell you on social media, somebody said that I went to fetch an oxygen, concentrate a cylinder for my father, and the girl was asked that if you do us some sexual favors, you'll get one. So these kind of things are, I'm not sure how much of it is being talked about. All kinds of that harassment happened, which people either hushed in or didn't talk about. So the question coming in here is about what happened when there were no witnesses to say, oh, harassment of this nature has happened. Professor Sen, would you like to answer that?
This is a question I think I get very often and I think about very often. It keeps going back to that idea of law and context. What you're saying is, not only are women to mind themselves in these situations, but they have to be vigilant enough to document it also. Again, there's disproportionate burden on women in terms of curating proof and so on and so forth. This question is interesting for two reasons. It's telling you that the demands that law make of a prevalence of a certain kind of behavior and how you present that matter before the appropriate body to judge is again fundamentally on women. Practically what happens when there is no witness, I think increasingly the conversation around this sort of aspect of sexual harassment or violence or so on and so forth is taking into account that witnesses may not always be present. So if you offer an account, the general idea is, until and unless something is fundamentally impossible to corroborate, there's a presumption they will take it at first person value. But then when you take the complaint further, all kinds of stereotypical imagination of the appropriate victim, reasonable behavior of the victim, and also just the framing of this individual as a victim, all of these things come and seep into the conversation. So what this question is in terms of how we imagine law and policy to evolve, or even society to evolve, is very pertinent. Because what this is really saying is, should women document instances of their violence or violation because it happens ever so often? If you think about the question like that, what it is saying is, this is likely to happen. Be vigilant and document it. What we should be saying instead is, why don't we tackle factors where the prevalence of this sort of instances can be reduced? So, the framing is very, very critical here.
Yeah, another aspect, and I would like you to maybe look at it, Shireen, is about mental health, which is of course again connected to all these issues that we are talking about. But we can see, in fact, I can tell you, even around us, we have seen women, who are losing, their mental strength somehow. We have seen people, so many people going away, losing of lives, struggling. Of relatives and dear ones in the hospitals, fighting for beds, ventilators, and begging for oxygens, all those things happening. It has weakened us internally in many ways. How do you really look at the whole mental framework strength getting weakened, especially women?
Before I can answer that, I want to quickly add to what Professor Ruedi just said. I just want to say that gender sensitivity of all the stakeholders in the legal process is something that needs to be worked on in the form of training or creating more awareness. Because what happens is, when a woman approaches the police officer, the authorities, then the courts, and so on and so forth, she is not dealt with in a manner of being a victim. There is a lot of adding insult to her injury, which has already taken place. And therefore, the larger question that we need to address, and the larger problem that we need to address, is getting some sensitivity to the issue that a woman is facing. And that is something that is lacking, and that dissuades a lot of women to complain, and they deal with it in their own way. And that is something that is largely problematic to deal with.
No, in fact, I would like to take your point ahead and say that, and what Professor Sen also said, is that yes, there was a problem, that in lockdown situation, there is a problem of movement. There is problem of communication. So saying is very easy that, just use your phone. There's a WhatsApp number, but I think even access to that phone, access to privacy to use that phone, then reach out to the right kind of people, and then expect them, as you're saying, Shireen, to show sensitivity, are all these points that we have to really, really very specifically look at, isn't it?
And in fact, it actually raises larger fundamental questions of the legal and policy issues that are involved. And therefore, a lot of policy and law has to change to account for these victim experiences, which is not happening today. So with respect to mental health, I would like to say it's a broader issue. It's a larger issue that is affecting society at large. If you think of the fact that the priority that mental health is getting today is that it has reached the conversation and dialogue space. But when you come to actually dealing with the issue of mental health through mental health practitioners, be it psychologists, psychiatrists, the stigma largely exists, and more so for women, because women are seen as more vulnerable in society, and to approach a medical practitioner has its own set of stigmas, right? And firstly, we have to begin with acknowledging the fact that mental health is a priority, similar to physical health. But that would take years of awareness and acknowledgement of the part of the people who are suffering from mental health itself and the people around them, be family, friends, relatives, etc. Second point is that the government needs to invest more on mental health resources. If you look at the state-supported mental health services, they are abysmal. They're even, of course, for physical health as well, we need to make vast improvements, and the pandemic has shown us that. But for mental health, it's far lesser. It is just coming about in our everyday conversation, then we are starting to accept that somebody could have these problems, right? So going a step beyond and actually seeking redressal to those problems is something that would require even more state funding, awareness, a lot of civil society work, and a lot of acknowledgement within family, friends, relatives of the person who is suffering from mental health issues, so that it does not turn into a very dire situation that cannot be sort of.
So one question that is coming in here is, what about someone who already had a pre-existing mental health condition? Then how to stop it, especially when it increased, maybe during the pandemic? Maybe Professor Sen, you can answer that.
as I was reading this question while Shireen was speaking, because this is an overarching issue in terms of how much emphasis we place on mental health and so on and so forth, I thought, regardless of the domestic health context, something is very important here. We need to create a support system and seek support, and that may not always be formal or institutional, specifically because the stigma around mental health and what sort of recourses you can take. With women in particular, historically, there has been a disregard of women's physical and mental health. Be it every time you go to a healthcare professional, it's undermined substantively, and by now we have enough body of work to to support this. There's not just other aspects of gender, but both physical and mental health pertaining to women are always seen as not a serious problem. So it's very deeply interconnected to creating formal and informal support structure. In this sense, if this individual has access to any kind of support, this could be a friend, this could be a family member, this could also be this is something we see recently. There's a lot of proliferation of online mental health platforms, and they also cater to your own financial needs at the moment. So if you inform them that you're not able to pay or so on and so forth, they simply adapt to your circumstances. So one way of doing this is to bring such people in contact with these conversations. As you said, there are privacy challenges also. Just because I can access, how am I going to have this conversation and where? So a lot of these platforms keep these things in mind, which goes back to what Shireen was saying, that if we understand the overarching context of where this is happening, we can adapt to that and just start the conversation. And then we see where we go from this. So, in my experience in particular, during the pandemic, there was a lot of curating of mental health resources, different kinds, not the way we imagine support to mental health to be, but completely personalized. Could be an individual who's talking to you, could be an individual connecting you to a group of individuals, could be through other social support networks, sometimes through local libraries, other public spaces you don't imagine as catering to mental health per se. So it's a very interesting civil society adaptation and integration to a particular problem, saying we don't have to institutionalize and formalize everything. It can also be a recourse, but this is one way. I'll give you a slightly different example of how this happened. I knew of community libraries that had turned into vaccination awareness centers. And similarly, as you know, I'm sure the two of you have seen this also, throughout this second wave, more than hospitals and institutions, I saw individuals doing this work, procuring oxygen, procuring different kinds of
Truly.
resources, connecting people to each other. So similarly, with mental health, this kind of platform has emerged. And I think we need to mainstream this conversation more, because mental health immediately makes us think something institutional. It doesn't have to be. It can be through these sort of networks as well.
How did you see social media playing out, Professor Sen? I mean, a lot of people put maybe more emphasis even on social media. We also saw, some of these problems that women and young girls faced. So it has both aspects. It has both perspectives. How would you really look at it? Overemphasis or usual?
I actually thought social media played a remarkable role. There are two reasons for it. Even though it's still confined more in certain kinds of spaces, obviously access to internet becomes very important. The connectivity it generated was staggering. I mean, I'm sitting here in the UK right now. I have been able to work with people in different parts of India. So the possibility of that emerged both from the internet and social media. The second thing is something we need to reflect on. Earlier, when we would look for information, we would have to go find it. In social media age, information comes at you constantly. So whether you're actively doing something about it or not, it's there at the back of your head. So these two aspects of social media were monumental in not just addressing COVID, but addressing other things that were centered because of COVID. Take domestic violence, for instance. A lot of people weren't even thinking about it. They came across something on social media, and that triggered a set of thinking and conversation. So it comes with its pros and cons, but for this specific instance, the way we've seen confinement to limit our other opportunities and resources, I think social media was remarkable.
And both of you can answer that, but also about education. So we saw online classes being held, which is good. I mean, we saw all these things about decisions about exams and how education should be taken forward. But your view, and also Shireen, as to what again it kind of exhibited or took forward in terms of how we are looking at future. Because even online classes, as we heard sometimes, though it's very, very good, but it again comes with share of challenges. For example, the ones who are attending it and the ones who are facilitating it. Professor Singh.
Shireen, why don't you take this one first? And
Okay.
then...
Okay, thank you, Professor Rohini. So online education is something that students as well as the instructors have to adapt to, and we have had now about a year and a half since the time we have been taking these online classes. There are two things that emerge from this. Firstly, human beings are so adaptable, and we have not seen this only from the education perspective, but across all sectors. We are adaptable and we have found ways and means to make online classes effective. Second thing that emerges is the beauty of these offline classes, right? When you have these physical classes, there is a lot of informal learning that is happening. And there's a lot of information that goes through the minds of the students simply because they are in class, and their attention span is much more as compared to the online classes. So there were I was a part of a lot of conversations that dealt with this question whether online classes can totally replace physical classes that takes place in schools and colleges. And what emerges from that conversation is that a hybrid model can be imagined where certain part of your coursework can be online and certain parts can be through physical classes. But definitely nobody in this conversation that was among the experts in the education sector imagined a situation where online classes can totally replace the physical classes, because it is not only about disseminating the knowledge and information, but also analytical skills, communication skills, the way information is processed, and also the things that you learn from your colleagues through discussion, debate, dialogue. So all of those things cannot be replaced at a higher education level, and these things can also certainly not be replaced at a primary and secondary education level, where the challenges were much more when it came to higher education, because of the fact that the learning abilities of people, of students who are in schools is very different from those who are at university level, and assessment patterns, the way you give grades, etc., also changes from a school level as compared to a university level. So definitely there has been a disruption in the education industry, but once the pandemic, and hopefully it ends soon, physical classes are bound to resume. And I think students and teachers and instructors all over, the educators are eager to visit their campuses and to engage in that kind of knowledge dissemination.
But also the silver lining. Let's look at the better side of it. So, for example, we are sitting in London, we are talking to Professor Senior. So even interacting with some of the experts who were, in other countries and getting insights from them also, I think, facilitated and added to a learning. So that's something that I see it as a very positive aspect. Some of these lectures that we've listened to online has really opened our own horizon of understanding. So some of the points, if you look at now, of course, the steps that the government should have taken, which in many cases it did not, how do we walk further, Professor Singh?
So, in terms of, and this becomes a multifaceted conversation, just quickly adding to what Shireen, already very beautifully articulated about education, and you as well, which is the access potential of online education. This has clearly emerged that you don't always have to be in a physical classroom. It has its own benefits, but there are people who can't afford to be in a physical classroom for a host of reasons. So the sheer potential of access that online education can generate is something that all structures can tap into. What do you need for that? You need to make internet available. You need to set the ground to make internet available. So structurally and policy wise, access to online education requires certain kinds of groundwork. That I think is one key takeaway in terms of how we can go forward. And it's just not just limited to the pandemic. It's limited to the way education is designed, cost of private education, gendered access to education, caste-based access, a host of things. So online access doesn't come with some of those inbuilt structural barriers. There is one structural consideration of the internet itself, but I think that's a key lesson. The second thing is, we are very adaptable and we took to the internet right away. But what we did was we took the model of a physical classroom and we put it online. There were online platforms. We literally just said, okay, now you go teach in Zoom. We didn't think of online pedagogy. And now that we are teaching online, at least to a certain extent, online pedagogy needs to be thought about very seriously. Because in some instances, We were walking into people's private homes. People had to keep their cameras off. Not everybody was in a position to turn them on. Some people were in domestic spaces where, that sort of privacy was difficult. So online pedagogy is a very, very specific thing that we need to think about. And work is being done in this domain. There are a group of people called, the Digital Humanities Archive. So we need to mainstream some of these conversations. And the other thing, and this is something, the more neoliberally education gets integrated, we need to think about this strongly. Very often these decisions are not made by the stakeholders. What I mean by that is teachers are rarely consulted about teaching processes. Students are rarely consulted about what sort of pedagogy we have in mind. These are decisions that are taken at a level of administration where I don't think the realities of classroom challenges, domestic habitation are taken into consideration. So we genuinely need to call people who are using these platforms, who are engaging with these platforms, and who will deploy these things to design them, and not just to dump it on them saying, okay, this is it, now you avail it and now you use it. So this multi-party stakeholder conversation is a way forward. This is equally applicable to conversations on privacy and domestic violence. People who inhabit the space are the best people to tell you about some of the challenges. This top-down tendency that we have, and in India we've seen this. Shireen will also tell you this, that
No, I can tell you also. I mean, we face this, though being in media, having been in the public sphere for so long, still in 2021. And I share your, please go ahead.
No, that's largely what I was saying, that consult the people who are actually engaged in the process of availing, of living these experiences, instead of assuming that you have a sense of what their perspective is. It makes the conversation more equitable, certainly more democratic, and genuine diverse perspective, not our imagination of what that perspective looks like. This is a challenge across every spectrum. And I think as policymakers, as decision makers, they seriously need to incorporate this vision in their thinking. It can't be top down. It has to be like this.
So what about vaccination, which is the recent buzz all around? And what about equity part there?
This is a very pertinent question. And, my engagement with vaccination has largely been through news that I'm following, medical reports that I'm following. And, my intervention will also be limited to that. And for instance, Covaxin, we don't have any data on it. If you're not able to procure data, it is creating other impediments. I mean, there are larger issues in place here with vaccination. Production of vaccine, the perception of vaccines coming from developing spaces and all of that. But specifically in the context of India, I think we know we have the wherewithal to produce. It's also a question of procuring the data, analyzing the data, making vaccination awareness a very integral part of, the social framework, because people in a lot of spaces don't want to take vaccines.
Okay.
Again, based on our earlier event, people in rural India were terrified of what the vaccine will do to them. And as I was telling you, community libraries stepped in saying that this is what the vaccine is, here is how it will impact you. And they were taking up, and they coordinated with ASHA workers to talk about the impact of vaccine on menstrual health and that whole gamut. So the work was happening both in terms of awareness, integration, and addressing these sort of challenges. I mean, making the vaccine available is only one part of the conversation. There's so much else that needs to be done. But I think
we need to have a second edition for sure, because there are too many things that I'm sure this session only will not be able to cover, but we'll keep on asking these questions. We'll keep on talking about these issues, and we'll keep on addressing those issues. We'll keep on drawing the attention of those who matter, so to say, to look at these issues pertinently. Deepak, if Madam Kalyani is unmuted and she's still there, then we can hear her.
Ma'am, Kalyani ma'am is not in the meeting.
Not here now. And I think due to the change of time, I don't see Dr. Nanda maybe, and I personally feel that there could be a time issue also. But anyways, coming to Shireen, now you talking about even sanitation workers or sanitation issues as such. So for example, we're talking about the menstrual hygiene to some of these problems that women face, some of these young girls, because many of them are part of our team, and the work that we do share is the kind of challenges they faced. Looking at these anxiety levels these young people have about what will happen tomorrow, careers, dreams, desires, many things, and also some of these unspoken troubles at home. So Shireen, how would you like to look at that?
I think that those are so many questions wrapped into
That I've
one.
asked here. You can break it and answer a little bit.
Yes, I think I would answer this more generally. So I would say that, you know, there's a lot of shame, honor, vulnerability. These words are used with women's bodies and minds quite significantly in everyday conversation. And that, you know, reduces the self-confidence as well as the self-esteem of women from a very young age, and that carries on into the workforce, that carries on into the family life, and so on and so forth, because girls become women who are insecure. I mean, men are also insecure, but the kind of conditioning that women face from an early age, because the entire repository of the family honor is in a woman's body, that creates a lot of restraints in terms of her choices. So this is stemming from the fact that the conditioning and child rearing practices in families, and what Professor Sen also said earlier, that, you know, we have to start these conversations at home, and we have to start them early, because once the mind is shaped in a certain direction, it is very difficult to change those stereotypes. So a large part of the problems that women are facing today has to do with the kind of rearing that has happened in homes, and that is conditioned. So at a larger level, what I feel is that the society puts a lot of restraints on women, and there are a lot of changes that a woman goes through, be it menstrual hygiene becomes a topic. You have so many body transformations that happen as you age. What we as women have to do is that there's a lot that is being said, written, spoken about what a woman should be and what a woman should not be. But those restraints should not constrain us from receiving an education, from employing ourselves and becoming financially independent, and making choices that are bold, making choices that we seem are necessary for our dreams, and to just cut out all the noise and unnecessary conversation that happens around women's bodies and their place in society. So a lot of this has to do with putting women in their place, and the idea is that though the society does that, we as women ourselves should not constrain ourselves even further than what the society has put limitations on. And we have remarkable examples today in the 21st century for us to understand that women can achieve as much or even more than men in many of these spaces. Top CEOs, politicians, lawyers, bureaucrats are all women. And the idea is that they have sort of broken the status quo at their own levels in order for others to take refuge in that kind of role modeling. So a lot of this has to do with self-esteem, self-confidence, and child rearing.
No, and that's why I must add here that, you know, we at Her World India also decided to look at regions. So in regions which are considered remote, regions where sometimes voices are not heard properly. So we are looking at Jammu and Kashmir, we are looking at Northeast very specifically, because we think sometimes that, let's say, imagining a village down there in Mizoram, Sikkim, or any other part of Northeastern region, sometimes we don't even know what's happening. Or let's say a person in Jammu and Kashmir, especially women. So we are at Her World India are trying to look at regions also and the women there, and as to what their challenges are, where we can hear them, have their voices here on this platform, and we're continuously trying to do that. So as we're trying to wrap up this final minutes, I think Professor Sen, your message, your last words on this session as to how do we walk together. Solidarity and empathy is very, very important. It's our key words that we always keep in mind. Apart from that, what is it that is needed to really empower us all together, and also tell others that what it means to be sensitive, understanding, and supportive?
And first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to the conversation. I think this in itself was one of those acts of solidarity where we were able to talk about a lot of things with a lot of ease, and bring them up in a manner that I think is accessible to a lot of people. You're right, solidarity, empathy are key, and this region focused work that you're doing is very, very important. I would just like to add one more word to that, is a sense of unlearning things that we thought were socially acceptable for a long period of time. Instead of thinking of those as aspirational, we want to center our lived experience and do some learning from there. And also understand knowledge as something that happens in different locations. It's not top down. It can come from different spaces. It looks different. Who we think is the expert is not limited to literacy or degree based knowledge. It completely comes from a certain sense of lived experience. And I think that's a third thing I want to add to solidarity, empathy, and unlearning what knowledge, not knowledge formation and creation is. and hope that we have many such conversations in the future.
Thank you so very much. And you're joining from there, and you've made your time available to us. In fact, you've tried to reschedule, I think, your timing, and we can only be very thankful to you. And now to you, Shireen, as you now would like to rush after the show, anything that you want to say?
Ma'am, I think there is some internet connectivity with Shireen, ma'am.
Which she has faced. Anyway, so on this platform, we must thank her, because also it's time. So we could thank Shireen and all those people who have participated. You can also write to us through emails or otherwise on our social media handles, which are on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And we're really, really trying to grow, get your suggestions, opinions, feedback all the time. And we can only be grateful again, once again, highly grateful to you, Professor Sen, that you joined. Shireen is visible once again, Shireen.
Yeah, sorry, my internet was a little, there was a problem.
It's okay.
Thank you for this opportunity, ma'am. And it was great conversing with Professor Rohini Sen, and it was a delight. And I hope that, we can take this conversation further as well, because this is an ongoing conversation, and hopefully it will not be an ongoing pandemic. At some point it will end.
Sure, I think we are looking at that ray of hope. And I think, as you rightly said, and both of you, through your very, very pertinent points that you've looked at, suggested, we can only feel very, very delighted on Herbal India. On behalf of my team, which sometimes many of them are backstage right now, but they are doing their work. Many of them are very young, but very vibrant. I must thank my team, Herbal India, Policy Center, and General Lab once again. Dr. Nanda, we were waiting for you, but maybe we'll hear from you soon. So thank you, all of you who are joining here or will be joining in our further shows. Thanks a lot, and keep believing in yourselves and keep raising your voice also when it's really needed. I'm sure Professor Sen agrees. Thank you, Professor Sen, for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
And Shireen, thank you so very much. And on Herbal India, I thank all of you once again this Saturday afternoon. Again, next Saturday, we'll be on with you with some other important topic and theme, and keep continuing to talk on these matters. Thank you so much once again.